Okay, right. Good afternoon, Philip. Welcome. Nice to have you back. A lot of you will have heard from Philip already in one of his talks last year, I believe it was. And we're delighted to welcome him back this afternoon. Just the title that Philip is talking about, just to describe it again for you. Approximately 10,000 Germans and Austrians fought for Britain during the Second World War, which means that about 1 in 7 of the German and Austrian refugees coming to Britain between 1933 and 1939 enlisted. Most of these were Jewish. Philip is now going to cover the stories of just a few of those remarkable people. So Philip, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Until the start of the COVID-19 virus, I was a curatorial volunteer for the Jewish Museum in Camden Town. So my talk today is one of a number of talks that were put together by the staff of the museum. So Jewish refugees in the British Armed Forces. The Jewish Museum London has some items in its collection that shed light on this still surprisingly little known topic. An important source of information about it is the collection of the Jewish Military Museum, formerly based in Hendon, which is now on loan to the Jewish Museum. The founder of the Military Museum, Henry Morris, its former archivist Martin Sugarman, and 2 volunteers, Susan Gordon and Lynn Stock, have done research on these collections, on which I shall be drawing today.
No, don't stop it. You've just...
It may be that some of you have members of your family or know those who are among the people that I'm going to mention. Although my talk is entitled Jewish Refugees in the Armed Forces, I'm focusing on refugees from Austria and Germany. And on this slide are pictured a group of such servicemen who were still serving in Berlin in 1946. In the middle at the back is Charles Lee, and I shall be mentioning Charles again later in my talk. The German and Austrian refugees were numerous, and they are a special case in many ways because these people were so-called enemy aliens. At times, the British government regarded them as enemies of Britain and subjected them to internment. It's therefore even more astonishing that so many wanted to serve for the British Armed Forces. Approximately 10,000 Germans and Austrians fought for Britain during the Second World War. That means around 1 in 7 of the German and Austrian refugees coming to Britain between 1933 and 1939 enlisted. Most of these were Jewish, but of course there were some non-Jewish refugees who were socialists or political opponents of Nazism. As we all know, as soon as the Nazis came to power, life for Jews and political enemies were getting harder. In 1935, the Nuremberg racial laws were put into force and Jews were increasingly hindered in leading a normal life. 3 years later, Austria was annexed in the Anschluss and the Nuremberg laws were implemented there as well. Kristallnacht in November of 1938 made it even clearer that the situation was becoming untenable for Jews. Around 70,000 Jews fled to Britain before 1939. Despite their obvious plight at the outbreak of the war, all Germans and Austrians in Britain were immediately classified as enemy aliens. By the end of 1939, the British government allowed them to join the non-combatant Auxiliary Military Pioneer Corps, later the Royal Pioneer Corps. The work they did was just as necessary for the war effort as combat roles. They built roads and huts, loaded and unloaded ships, cleared bomb damage, and had other duties in the logistics of the war. However, it wasn't the most glamorous type of war work. Anton Walter Freud, a grandson of Sigmund Freud, said about the Pioneer Corps, its cap badge showing a pick and shovel was not one that he was very proud of. Many had hoped to go to the front to fight. However, the Pioneer Corps would remain the only unit allowed to Jewish enemy alien refugees until 1943. Despite the fact that 5 alien companies joined the expeditionary force into France, the sentiment against enemy aliens only changed after Dunkirk. About 27,000 Jewish refugees were interned in Britain, although not those who had already volunteered with the Pioneer Corps. Canada and Australia offered to take internees, and about 7,500 were sent there and stayed until 1941. Internees could apply to serve in the Pioneer Corps, and they were amongst the earliest to do so, and 3,000 enlisted then. So who were the people that joined? Many of those who joined had come to the UK as children, some on the Kindertransport between 1938 and 1940. An example is Martin Thor. He was born in Berlin and came to Britain on the Kindertransport in 1939 when he was around 15 years old. His sponsor family lived in Leicestershire, and he seemed to have started working in a factory in Leicester soon after. He was military trained in Glasgow and served with the Leicestershire Regiment in India. He was transferred to the Army Reserve in 1946. Others came with their families as adults. For instance, Frederick Stephen Mercer, born Fritz Sigmund Meersbacher in Bavaria. He was 28 when he came to England in 1935 and was the director of a company that imported toys from Germany. 5 years later, he joined the Auxiliary Military Pioneer Corps. He must have served in northwestern Europe, as this invitation on this slide to a French ball and other documents in the collection suggest. He seems to have worked there as an interpreter. A number of adults had been interned in concentration camps before they managed to escape Germany. The refugees tended to be between 20 and 50 years old when they enlisted. An example is Charles Lee. He was on the first slide that I showed. He was born Karl-Heinz Liebenau in Berlin and grew up in an observant Jewish middle-class family. By 1935, his father Max, who worked in the clothing trade, found it increasingly difficult to get regular work, and the family had to move to a smaller apartment and obtain help from Jewish charities. Charles and his sister Helga left Berlin as part of the Kindertransport on the 3rd of May 1939. Charles left school at 14 and worked as a baker, then as a furrier and a fire watcher. He volunteered for the Home Guard in early 1944 and joined the army in May, serving in the infantry of the Royal Sussex Regiment. He was posted to various camps around Britain before being sent to Germany in June 1946 as an interpreter. At his own request, he was posted to Berlin, where he was reunited with his surviving relatives. In September 1947, he was naturalized as a British subject and was demobbed in February 1948. Charles is an interesting case because his father fought against the British in the German army in the First World War. He's shown on the photograph on the left of the slide, Max Liebenau. He was on the extreme left and has a cross mark on his chest there. There were even a few examples of people who fought on both sides. To do justice to all those Jewish men and refugees who fought in British but were not German or Austrian, I want to mention the example of 2 Jewish men who served either in the British Army or under the British. The first is Samson Altman, who was born in Poland in 1919 and became orphaned when his father died. He was apprenticed with a butcher and continued to work in that trade until 1939. When the Germans invaded Poland, he was arrested by the Gestapo because his best friend had betrayed him. However, he managed to get away and got on a train to the Russian part of Poland. There he was caught by the Polish army and imprisoned in Minsk on suspicion of being a spy. In 1941 he was released and he went to live in Minsk. Then he had to flee the German attacks by going to Smolensk, Moscow and Tashkent, where he eventually joined the Anders Army, a part of the Free Polish Armed Forces in the West. He was transferred to Palestine and then Scotland, where he joined the 28th Infantry Division and became a tank instructor. On the 6th of June 1944, he landed in Normandy on Juno Beach. He stayed 2 years in occupied Germany to look for Nazis and Gestapo and SS and hand them over to the British. After the war, he stayed in London and, having not seen 2 of his brothers after 46 years, was reunited with them. The second is the father of our own Kathy Peters, who most of you know is a member of our Shul Council. Harry Benton, born Rudolf Müller in Czechoslovakia, escaped to the UK via Palestine and France. As he spoke German and was a trained mechanic, it was suggested that he join the Czech army in exile. His answer was that he came to the UK to escape anti-Semites, not to join them. So he joined the Remis, and upon going to France, his commanding officer suggested that he change his name to a more English-sounding one. So he took a telephone directory and put a pin on the name and became Harry Benton. The motivations of those who served are probably as diverse and complex as the individuals themselves, but it's obvious that the experience of persecution or of having to flee, often leaving family behind, must have been a major reason for fighting the Nazi enemy. Although it wasn't always easy for them in this country, and many have appear to have felt rather foreign at first. But they had a deep sense of gratitude towards the country that had given them a new home and a related sense of duty because of it. Gerhard Heilig was the son of a prominent left-wing journalist, Bruno Heilig. He was sent to England on a Kindertransport and he joined the RAF. He wanted to become a pilot, but became a wireless operator in the RAF. After the war, he became a civilian pilot working for Austrian Airlines. In 1964, he wrote, "I was only too aware that Britain had undoubtedly saved my life, and I wouldn't have been happy to have taken advantage of my situation and let others do the dirty work." For refugees, like many young British people, the outbreak of war seems to have come at a time of transition and change in their lives. Enlisting appeared as an opportunity, while they were also swept up by the general wave of outrage and motivation to fight Hitler. Ruth Schneider, née Maisels, a young woman who had come with her Yiddish playwright-actor parents from Vienna, was interned on the Isle of Man and later went on to study dress design in London. She was still very young when Britain entered the war. She joined the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, or the Auxiliary Territorial Service, and was later involved in radar control. As I mentioned before, many wanted to fight at the front rather than doing more administrative or logistical jobs. The War Office recognized rightly that because of their national identity and their language skills, the refugees would be an important asset in special operations. For instance, to go behind enemy lines and gather intelligence, to help as interpreters, and to interview prisoners of war and intercept enemy communications. Like Harry Benton, most changed their names to an English one once they were transferred from the Pioneer Corps in case they were captured by the enemy. One unit in the Commandos, a secret unit trained to carry out clandestine intelligence operations called 3 Troop, or also known as X-Troop, consisted only of German-speaking refugees, including Czechs and Hungarians. They were subjected to very hard training, long marches, parachuting and rock climbing training. They were also trained in hand-to-hand fighting and the use of explosives. Someone who served in the commandos is John Waxman, not a relation of mine, I'm afraid. Born Wolfgang Waxman in Breslau in 1924, he left Germany with his mother and brother in 1935, was interned and then joined the Pioneer Corps. Because he had won a boxing contest, he was encouraged by the army to join the commandos. On D-Day, he glided into Normandy as part of the 6th Airborne Division. As the Nazis attacked them, his glider was riddled with bullets, but just about managed to land. In a later part of the conflict, a shell exploded right next to him and he was blown unconscious. He was eventually demobbed because of his injuries. There was a German and Austrian contingent of the Special Operations Executive, the SOE, formed in 1942 to sabotage Nazi communication and supplies network and liaise with resistance and the partisans. One of them was Anton Walter Freud, whom I mentioned to you before. Together with a small unit, he was parachuted into Austria in the spring of 1945. He was going to be a radio operator once landed. However, the operation didn't go strictly to plan, and the various members of the group landed far from the target point and from each other. He managed to take over an aerodrome single-handed, and he had told them that he had a direct order from General Montgomery. It seemed peculiar, but the German commanding officer appears to have feared the approaching Russians more than the British. He was later to become part of the War Crimes Investigation Unit. One woman who absolutely needs a mention here was Vera Maria Rosenberg. Born in Bucharest to a German Jewish father and a British Jewish mother, she came to London with her parents in 1933, where she adopted her mother's maiden name of Atkins. She studied modern languages at the Sorbonne and travelled widely in Europe, eventually managing to get out of the occupied Netherlands with the help of the Belgian resistance. She joined the French section of the SOE when they were recruiting men and women who could pass as French nationals. Ultimately, she sent more than 400 agents into occupied territory. At least 100 of them never returned and were reported missing, believed dead after the war. 12 of these women died in German concentration camps. Vera Atkins had helped prepare these women for their missions, and when the war was over, she went out to Germany to find out what had happened to them and to the other agents lost behind enemy lines. But while the woman who carried out this extraordinary mission appeared quintessentially English, she was nothing of the sort. Vera Atkins, who never married, covered her life in mystery so that even her closest family knew almost nothing of her past. As you can imagine, the risks that Jewish refugees ran were much higher than any other soldiers. They would have been treated as traitors, and being Jewish would have certainly aggravated their situation. One soldier, Stephen Dale, born Heinz Gunther Spangler, tells us of the high risk he ran of being discovered. Having been interned in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp before coming to Britain, he was interned in Australia before joining the Pioneer Corps and then moving on to the SOE. He was parachuted into the Dolomites, but like Walter Freud, landed in the wrong place and was captured. He was sent to prison in Italy and then to Stalag 17A near Vienna and later Brunswick. He said, "To be taken prisoner of war is always a depressing experience, but my situation was aggravated by the constant fear of being discovered by the Germans to be a Jew of German origin. In his case, his German Jewish identity meant that in one war he had been imprisoned on both sides of the conflict. Guy Bishop, born Gunther Gustav Bruegg from Gera, was part of the Black Watch, the famous Black Watch. In 1944, he crossed the Rhine to gather intelligence and prepare the landing area. He was first to jump off the raft after crossing the Rhine, narrowly avoiding machine gun fire that his comrades experienced when they tried to land. Like many others, he later interrogated prisoners of war and was involved in the denazification process. After the armistice, many of the refugees stayed in Germany and Austria and were involved in the denazification process, in which the knowledge of German was obviously absolutely vital. After the division of Germany and Austria into 4 foreign-controlled sectors, each refugee from fighting regiments and alien pioneer companies was sent to the British Control Commission and the British Army of the Rhine for the interrogation of prisoners. Their job was to hunt for Nazi criminals, collect evidence for the War Crimes Investigation Unit, and translate at War Crime Tribunal. Refugees who had been lawyers helped to define and translate new democratic laws, and refugees examined Germans for roles in the new German democratic state. Some were charged with listening into conversations of prisoners of war, like those at Trent Park in Enfield. Several refugees were involved in liberating Bergen-Belsen and were obviously traumatized by what they had witnessed there. Fred Pelican, born Fritz Pelican in Upper Silesia, had survived Dachau concentration camp before coming to Britain. He served in the Pioneer Corps in Britain and in Northwest Europe until 1945, and then served with the War Crimes Investigation Unit. Among other things, he and Walter Freud investigated Dr. Bruno Tesch and brought him to justice. His factory, Tesch and Stabenow, had produced Zyklon B for the concentration camps. I just want to make mention of Moises Casa to show that not everybody was involved in close combat, but all did their bit. He came here in 1939 in his 20s and volunteered for the Pioneer Corps. He had studied at a seminary to become a rabbi. In addition to being an ordinary soldier, he took it upon himself to take on the role of a voluntary army chaplain, because there weren't enough chaplains to go round to cater for the Jewish soldiers who had been dispersed in different units. By the end of 1947, the vast majority were demobilized. During 1946 and 47, they applied to become citizens and were naturalized. Many of them became very well known. As I said, many felt a deep gratitude towards Britain, which motivated them to fight. Moreover, it seemed that the war experience maybe the comradeship and the life under duress contributed to a feeling of belonging, despite incidents of anti-Semitism and despite the suspicion with which refugees were treated in official government policy. Willy Field, born in Bonn in 1920 as Willy Hirschfeld, who came to England as a young man in 1939, enlisted in the Pioneer Corps and was later transferred to the Royal Armoured Corps. He took part in the D-Day landings and fought in Holland and in the capture of Hamburg. He lost a large part of his family in the Holocaust. He, like John Waxman, who I mentioned before, and many others, felt that this was their war. Learning about the death of their families and the Holocaust must have been absolutely devastating for the refugees. Nevertheless, several didn't always feel hatred, and remarkably, they had a forgiving attitude towards their enemies. Gideon Gunther Berendt enlisted in the Pioneer Corps before volunteering for the Parachute Regiment. Speaking about the day he was waiting to jump into occupied Europe to fight and terminate Hitler's reign, he wrote, "Oddly enough, the urge for revenge had by then already been replaced by a sober and professional consideration, just as no good boxer would enter the ring blindfolded by hatred. I kept to the rules." An even more generous attitude came from Colin Anston. Born Klaus Leopold Octavia Ascher in Berlin in 1922. He was raised as a Protestant, but his father was Jewish and obviously an outspoken against the Nazi regime. Colin came here on the Kindertransport and joined the Pioneer Corps, and later, as part of the commandos, he was involved in the invasion of Sicily and Italy. After the end of the war, he was attached to the Control Commission for Germany, and he went to Frankfurt, where he was reunited with his mother. He felt really estranged from Germany, and his longing for his military comrades showed him how much he had changed. In Frankfurt, he found out who had betrayed his father, and he was tempted to pay this person a visit, but he said that he did nothing. Why? Because his religious upbringing reminded him that revenge is mine, said the Lord, and he just couldn't bring himself to exact revenge.
More fool him.
Yes. However, they undoubtedly felt rage at times. Harry Rosny, who served in the Pioneer Corps, after D-Day, he tells us of a situation where he had to guard some prisoners of war who didn't realize that he'd understood their conversations. Word, he says, got around that the prisoners were planning to escape that night. One of his colleagues said that he'd hoped that they did, and that he intended to shoot every single one of them. To his surprise, he says, he felt a deep hatred for the prisoners, but after all the years in England, he couldn't bring himself to do that. I'd like to conclude this talk by saying that there are very, very many more examples of bravery, courage, and sense of duty of Jewish refugees in the British Armed Forces that could be told here. At a time when hundreds of thousands fled from the oppression of their home countries, let's not forget that these Jewish refugees made a substantial contribution to win the war and enable us to live in freedom. Thank you.
Wow.
Okay, right. Thank you, Philip. That was extremely interesting. Let me just get some people up. Right. As you say, I think that's a level of information that most of us would not know about in terms of the contribution made by Jewish men and women, and the risks that some of them took. And I don't doubt that perhaps some of them didn't survive the war and took the risk by going back to Germany or wherever and carried out their duties until they were stopped by the enemy. But thank you very much. Very interesting. Right. Anybody got some questions for Philip? Just raise your hands if you can, and I'll try and spot you. Anybody?
Just as well, because I'm not sure I know very much about it outside of this talk.
Okay. Okay.
I thought Leslie Daniels had her hand up.
No. Jasmine.
Jasmine. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, carry on.
Yeah. Very, very much. That was very, very interesting. And I wondered if there is any a book written that encompasses all that information, or somewhere where it can be picked up.
I'm sure there are lots of books on the subject. I don't know offhand of any of the names of the books, but as I said at the beginning, the Jewish Museum, the Jewish Military Museum, does have a lot of detailed information about these people and others. So when this virus is over and we're able to go to the Jewish Museum, I encourage people to do that. I know that they've been shut down during the virus, as most museums have, and people would have read in the Jewish press that they've been going through a very difficult time. It certainly will be different when they open again to admit people, but they're working, I know, on providing information about what they have in the museum online, and I'm sure that you'll be able to interrogate their database to see more about these people and others.
Philip, can I ask, I've been to the Jewish Museum a number of times, and they have different exhibitions from time to time, the East End, etc. Obviously, you're telling us the military museum is there now. Is that a very significant display? Because I hadn't seen it before. Does it encompass just the Second World War, or does it go back even further than that?
It does go back further than that. It goes back to the beginnings of Ajax and before that. It goes, they have materials on the Boer War, for example, and even before that, the Napoleonic Wars. So, yeah, I've given a talk on Jews in the British forces, which most of the information came from the Ajax Museum, from the Jewish Military Museum. As far as coverage is concerned, in the limited space that the Jewish Museum had when they took in the Military Museum, it's not that much. But as I say, I think that it's going to be very different after the virus, or when the museum opens again, and there'll be a lot less on show there. And as a result, I'm sure that they'll be working on having people be able to visit virtually.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions for Philip? Anything you would like to ask him while he's got on? Philip, can you just perhaps... Sorry, go on, somebody else was there. Was that somebody else? No? Okay. Just screening across, see if there's anybody there.
Can you hear me?
Yes, who is that?
Oh, it's Nova Scott.
Go on then, Nova.
My father was in the First World War and in the trenches for 3 years in the Somme, and I have very little. I do have his number because Rabbi Selaznik found out what units he was in, and he was wounded and sent to and came back again to the line. But I don't have much about him at all from that point of view. I don't even know what hospital he went into. I know he was wounded. I know he was mentioned for bravery in dispatches, and I can't find any of that either. Where's the best way to find out a bit more about him being in the Somme and in the trenches for 3 years? And he was underage when he went as well.
Yeah, you'd have to go to the British Army, the forces, the British Army forces, armed forces, do have a huge amount of information about people who served. You can find an appropriate contact, just putting in his name in Google. If you've got access to Google, do a Google search on his name. I think you will find there a lot of information about him.
I've got the numbers, his number, and the two units he was in.
Well, that's always very helpful. If you get through to the army, then you'll need that information to find out as much as the army.
The army information.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Anybody else?
Okay, I mean, I just know his number, and I know that he was underage and that he was in the trenches and everything. But I haven't got more I don't even have any medals or anything. I've got nothing, not even because all the ones who were in the trenches got medals. I haven't even got that.
Yeah.
So Nova, it sounds like if you get onto the Army Museum, you'll be able to find out probably an awful lot about him that you clearly have gaps on at the moment. So that'll keep you occupied for the next week or two, and perhaps you can come back and tell us a story.
Which museum are you talking about?
The Army Museum. Go on, Philip.
Oh.
Yeah, no. If you get onto, if you do a search for his name and his serial number,
Yes, because
on Google, you'll go through to the Army Information section, and there you can complete forms, and they'll provide you with as much information you want. In fact, if he has never been issued a medal,
I've got nothing of his, nothing at all.
claim it. You could claim it on as his daughter. You could get it even now.
Rabbi had a book of all the soldiers were in the First World War, and he found my father in that.
Yeah.
Okay. Nova, sounds like you've got Nova. Sounds like you've got some digging to do, and perhaps come to shore one day with your father's medal pinned onto your jacket. So we'll wait and hear from you on that. Sorry, somebody else.
Peter Hammerman.
Okay, Peter, over to you. Unmute yourself. Unmute yourself. Okay, go on.
No.
Unmute yourself, Peter.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Okay. He served in Africa in the Second World War, and I knew nothing much about him. But there was something in one of the papers where you could write into the MOD, give them 30 quid, and they would give you. I was after his movements, so I knew nothing about it. And I wrote into the MOD with the 30 quid, and they said yes. They sent me back two double full scat, two A3 sheets of paper with just 2 lines on, which meant nothing to me. So I wrote back saying I want to know his movements. And as he was in the RAF, they referred me to the RAF history section, and I wrote him again. And eventually, they said they needed his service record. And I realised these 2 A3 sheets of paper with the 2 lines on were his service record. So I sent those in, and about a month later, I got them back again. Somebody had handwritten every unit he was with and every movement. There are about 15 of them. And I managed to track the desert campaign by these movements. It was quite interesting. And so I got the history from that. I think the MOD will be the first step. But also I wrote in saying what medals should he have received. And again, about a month later, I got a whole pack back with copy. I already had his medals, but I got copies of the medals he should have received with ribbons, etc. So it was quite interesting. So there are ways you can get these things, but I think you need to possibly start with the MOD.
Sounds like you've got some digging to do there, Nova, and we'll wait to hear from you. Okay, anybody else? No? Okay. Philip, thank you very much. That was interesting. I'm sure you've got some other interesting talks up your sleeve someday, and we'll come back to you on that. Just next week, we've got our own Leslie Pollock. Title of his talk is The Archaeology of the Exodus, and he poses a number of questions. Were the children of Israel ever slaves in Egypt? Were the plagues myths or miracles? Who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus? Is there any archaeological evidence to support the Torah? Leslie says he'll be giving answers to all these questions. So we look forward to that, Leslie. Thank you very much. And we look forward to getting some answers to things that we have some questions on. So thank you once again, Philip. Thank you for your talk. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. Keep well, look after yourselves, and PG, see you all next week.